In 1917, over 300 years of Romanov rule came to an end. In its wake, a provisional government was formed to transition Russia from a Tsarist autocracy into a democratic republic. In its first proclamation, the Provisional Government granted the people a variety of freedoms, amnesty for all political offenses, and the promise of a constituent assembly elected based on universal suffrage. In a matter of days, Russia became, in Lenin's words, the freest country in the world. But in less than a year, the Provisional Government was overthrown and replaced by a Bolshevik dictatorship. The failure of the Provisional Government was largely the fault of its lack of popular support. The revolution that brought down the monarchy was a spontaneous revolt by the common people. They did the heavy lifting and wanted a government that represented their interests. The problem was that by this time the masses had gone too far left to tolerate a moderate liberal government. But it didn't have to be this way. At the beginning of the 20th century, the socialist movement still didn't have the full support of the working class. This was in part because they believed that there was still a chance to reform the monarchy instead of overthrowing it. Throughout Russian history, the myth of the good Tsar portrayed the monarch as a father-like figure that had the best interests of the people. That's why when Father Gapon and his followers marched on the Winter Palace, they carried with them portraits of Nicholas instead of red banners. But all this was to change. On that fateful day, Father Gapon and his followers were fired upon by government troops. The 1905 revolution did two things. The first was that it destroyed the myth of the good Tsar and turned the people against Nicholas. The second was that it convinced people that the only way to enact change was by overthrowing the monarchy. Russia's first parliament, the Duma, was almost completely powerless, and the right to vote was heavily restricted. Consequently, the working class became radicalized in socialist ideology because it gave them an alternative. This could have been avoided if Nicholas had improved the material conditions of the people. Even some moderate reforms could have kept them from sympathizing with the socialists. Whatever reforms occurred after 1905 were too little too late. The Provisional Government was originally made up of members of the Duma, but as mentioned, the Duma was not elected via universal suffrage. They basically appointed themselves without consulting the people. To make things more difficult, the dominant party in the Provisional Government was a Constitutional Democratic Party led by Pavel Milyukov. The KPD, as they were known, represented the Russian middle class. After the revolution, the upper classes also began to support them for lack of an alternative. The problem was that these groups represented a minority of the population. Because of radicalization, the masses became increasingly alienated from their new rulers and frustrated that it wasn't their people in charge. When the composition of the Provisional Government's first cabinet was announced, most people had no idea who these men were. Most of them were liberals who were completely unknown by the public. When it was announced that Prince Lvov would become prime minister, the crowd was outraged. In the words of one furious soldier, all they had done was replace the Tsar with a prince. The only exception was Alexander Kerensky, the cabinet's only socialist. His name was the only one that sparked a cheerful reaction from the crowd, who considered him as one of their own. The only institution that had the approval of the masses were the Soviets. Unlike the Duma, the deputies of the Soviets had been elected. If you look at pictures of the first deputies of the Petrograd Soviets, you'll see that most of them are dressed in military uniforms, as they were the soldiers that made the revolution possible. Eventually, more workers and members of leftist parties were given seats. Though not perfect, the Soviets did a much better job at representing the population. But instead of taking over, the early leaders of the Soviets opted for a system of dual power in which the Provisional Government and the Soviets would coexist. But the question is, why? The simple answer is that they didn't want to seize power. Many socialist figures, especially radicals like Lenin, were in exile. Those who remained, such as Kerensky, were of the most moderate type. The democratic left, who I'll refer to as moderates, quickly took over the Soviets and favored collaborating with the Provisional Government for practical reasons. But they feared that by seizing power, they would trigger a counter-revolution and cause a civil war. On top of that, many of the Soviet deputies, with a few exceptions, had little experience in governing a country the size of Russia. But the main factor had to do with Marxist theory. Russian socialists believed that socialism couldn't be achieved in a mostly agrarian society like Russia. After all, you can't establish a dictatorship over the proletariat if the proletariat barely exists. Russia would first have to go through a bourgeois revolution to make the jump from feudalism to capitalism, turning Russia's agrarian economy into an industrial economy. Industrialization also meant that the peasantry, who the moderates believed would be hostile to socialism, would decrease in size, as many would migrate to the cities and join the proletariat. Democracy would also grant civil liberties needed to mobilize the working class and instill within them a strong class identity. This is why, instead of opposing the Provisional Government, the Soviets opted to give the middle class the reins of power. However, there were two massive problems. The first is that the masses didn't understand the reasoning of the moderates. A lack of education meant that they weren't all that well versed on Marxist theory and couldn't understand why they had the weight. For the workers, socialism meant that they would control the factories. For the soldiers, it meant an end to the war. And for the peasants, it meant land reform. They didn't understand why they had to wait when it was them who overthrew the monarchy in the first place. During the unrest of the July days, the people were literally begging the Soviets to take power. But they refused. The frustration of the people with the moderates is best demonstrated when a group of sailors stormed into the Taurus palace and took an SR leader named Viktor Chernov hostage. One of his captors angrily approached him and, with his fist in the air, shouted, "Son of a bitch, take power when it's offered to you." The second problem was that the middle class, entrusted to lead the bourgeois revolution, didn't believe that Russia was ready for democracy either. Pavel Milyukov and many of his cadets believed that the instability caused by the war and revolution made the establishment of a democratic republic impossible. The cadets wanted a military dictatorship to re-establish order and put Russia on the right path, giving up power when the time was right. In May of 1917, the cadets even resigned from the Provisional Government, opting to support right-wing generals such as Kornilov to take over. This is the reason why Milyukov tried to save the monarchy, because at that moment he didn't see any alternative. The only people who supported the Provisional Government was the Democratic left, who themselves were hesitant to accept positions within it. Because of their reluctance to seize power, the masses lost faith in the moderates and began searching for new leaders. After years of exile, Lenin returned to Russia in April and soon presented to the Petrograd Soviet his April theses. Lenin advocated for many things, among which was no support for the Provisional Government and for the establishment of a republic led by the Soviets. Lenin believed that it was unnecessary to go through a bourgeois revolution and that Russia could make the jump straight to socialism. Instead of a thunderous applause, Lenin's thesis was greeted by laughter and mockery. Even many Bolsheviks were unsupportive. But instead of changing his stance, all this mockery did was convince Lenin that if all power was to be seized by the Soviets, it would have to be done not by a coalition of the left, but by his party. Prior to his return, the few Bolsheviks in Russia had been collaborating with other socialist factions. But upon arrival, Lenin re-established his authority and drove a wedge between them and the rest of the Soviets. As demonstrated by the July days, the slogan "All power to the Soviets" became increasingly popular. As the masses grew frustrated with the moderates, many turned to the Bolsheviks and other radical groups that supported the overthrow of the Provisional Government. In election after election, the Bolsheviks became more powerful, while the supporters of dual power became less popular. When they seized power in October, the Bolsheviks had a sturdy base of support, while those who didn't support them were apathetic towards their opponents. The final nail in the coffin for the monarchy was the material deprivations caused by World War I. If the Provisional Government wanted to avoid the same fate, then they'd have to bring an end to the war. The cadets were too patriotic to concede anything to the Central Powers, and many of them wanted Russia to annex more land. The moderate left was less belligerent, but believed that Russia had a right to defend herself. The Provisional Government adhered to Russia's commitment to continue the war. They wanted to remain on good terms with the Allies, who they also owed lots of money to, and bring the war to a victorious end. At first glance, their stance on the war seems reasonable. The problem is that the soldiers thought otherwise. When war broke out in 1914, Russia's mostly peasant soldiers didn't know what they were fighting for. They didn't share the same sense of patriotism as the upper classes. The peasantry identified more with their native regions than with the nation, as the Tsarist government had done little to instill within them a sense of national identity. This is why desertion was so common. Things only got worse during the Revolution. The first ever decree passed by the Petrograd Soviet, Order No. 1, basically destroyed the Russian army by taking away authority from the officers. Since then, it became increasingly more difficult to control the troops, and desertion became more common. To make matters worse, leftist agitators in the army began to undermine the authority of the new government. The Provisional Government believed that the same patriotism demonstrated during the February Revolution would manifest itself at the front, but as we'll see, this wasn't the case. Not wanting to back down, the Provisional Government believed it necessary to launch an offensive to turn the tide of the war. Kerensky was personally involved in the preparations. He made countless trips to the front to inspire the troops to continue fighting and improve Russia's position in the war. Kerensky was a very dramatic but also talented public speaker. In his youth, he had aspired to become an actor and certainly applied what he had learned during his career in politics. When meeting the troops, he immediately received a positive reaction, which convinced him that the men would obey the order to advance. But upon leaving, the initial enthusiasm of the soldiers quickly evaporated. Opposition to the offensive was widespread, not just in the army, but also throughout broader society. After the initial success of the attack, the troops simply refused to advance and started to retreat. Order and cohesion finally vanished when the Germans counterattacked and the Russian army was routed. Back in Petrograd, demonstrators began to demand an end to the war and for all power to be handed over to the Soviets. The offensive that bore his name was a personal disaster for Kerensky and an even greater one for the government. The inability to understand that the masses, let alone the troops, were against the continuation of the war only resulted in further unrest and the questioning of the authority of the state. Just as the war had brought down the Tsar, it was also to blame for the fall of the Provisional Government. The final nail in the coffin for Kerensky's reputation came in September. Having lost the full support of the Soviets, Kerensky appointed General Lev Kornilov as commander of the Russian army, in hopes of appeasing the political right. However, the two men had a falling out in what is known as the Kornilov affair. The event is rather controversial, but to summarize it, Kornilov marched on the Petrograd with soldiers loyal to him, intending on overthrowing the Soviets and the Provisional Government. Not having any choice, Kerensky was forced to cooperate with the Bolshevik Red Guards to stop the coup. Before any serious bloodshed, the defenders convinced Kornilov's men to surrender and hand over their weapons. Kornilov, along with many other officers, were also detained and incarcerated. It may seem that Kerensky came out on top, but the affair had two serious consequences. Kornilov was the darling of the right. He was a military leader that men like Pavel Milyukov wanted to restore order to Russia. But after being incarcerated and labeled a traitor, the cadets and the officer corps withdrew what little support they were giving Kerensky. This is why practically no one came to his aid during the Bolshevik takeover. The second consequence is that Kerensky also lost what little support he had from the Soviets. The Bolsheviks and other radical factions had already been gaining more seats. Because of his cooperation with non-socialist factions, the left became very suspicious of Kerensky. There were even conspiracy theories that claimed that Kerensky had been secretly working with Kornilov to overthrow the Soviets and install himself as a dictator. After the whole ordeal, it wasn't a matter of if the Bolsheviks were going to try and seize power, but when. Overall, the Kornilov affair highlighted one of the Provisional Government's greatest weaknesses, the lack of an armed force. After the Tsarist police had been disbanded, they were replaced by a militia, but these militiamen were hardly competent or reliable. The army was disintegrating, the officers were untrustworthy, and the Red Guards were close to the Bolsheviks. What this did was leave the Provisional Government extremely vulnerable. Even a few reliable regiments could have been enough to stop the Bolsheviks, but the only forces that Kerensky could muster were a few Cossacks, scared women, and literal children. The failure of the Provisional Government to make the transition from autocracy to democracy stems from their crisis of authority. The masses had been driven too far left to tolerate a government that they hadn't elected. If something like the Provisional Government had come earlier, then maybe they would have succeeded. But the time had run out. The people couldn't understand the reasoning of the democratic left for cooperating with non-socialist parties. After all, it was they who had overthrown the Tsar, and they wanted leaders who'd give in to their demands. Not even the people who were supposed to run the Provisional Government had faith in it either. If anything, the Russian Revolution of 1917 demonstrates the importance of action during times of upheaval. Since it was only supposed to be temporary, the Provisional Government couldn't implement any serious reforms, such as those related to land and ethnic minorities. The Bolshevik takeover could only have been avoided if the Constituent Assembly had been elected sooner. That way, Russia would have had a government with the confidence of the people before any armed groups became too powerful. 1917 was one of those rare moments in Russian history when the country could have followed a more democratic path. Though they made some positive contributions, the Bolsheviks continued the long tradition of autocracy that started since medieval times. If things had turned out differently, then maybe Russia could have become a freer country than what it is today. Anyways, that's the end of the video. If you made it through all the way, please subscribe. Please give me money. I have a Ko-fi page for that, and I would really appreciate it. You don't have to. I mean, yeah, I'm not forcing you to. But anyways, I hope you all enjoyed and have a very good day, and I'll see you all next time. Goodbye.